everybody. Welcome back to our class on effective conflict intervention. I'm Frank Markow, and I'm your professor for this class. Last week, we talked about the importance of understanding emotions and goals and perspective taking in conflict situation. This week, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and the main topics we're going to talk about are power dynamics in conflict. We're going to talk about different conflict styles that we all adopt. And then we're also going to talk about dysfunctional strategies, dysfunctional styles that we want to avoid like the plague. All right, so that's where we're going today. Hang on to your hat as we jump on in. Now, let's start off giving a brief definition of power. Now, by the way, I want to mention, sometimes as Christians we get a little uncomfortable with this topic, right? We have such an attitude to serve others and humble ourselves and striving for unity, and those are all important Christian virtues. Power is not necessarily good or bad in a conflict situation. It can be bad, but in and of itself is not necessarily good or bad. It just simply is. Power is a dynamic in any conflict situation. And so avoiding giving it a value judgment right off the bat is important. Otherwise, if it's taboo, if it's off the table, then we can't talk about it. And again, I'm not advocating for the use of Machiavellian power in order to win conflicts. I would never do that. And I don't think you should do that either. But it's important, though, for Christians and non-Christians alike to understand this idea of power dynamics in any conflict situation. And that's why it's so important for us to look at, because it is there. Whether you acknowledge it or like it, it is there. So let's define power quickly here. Well, a short definition, is the ability to cause or influence outcomes. Now, if you're in a conflict, you want to influence the outcomes, right? You're trying to advocate for your position. You're trying to, win the conflict and get your point across so that the decision, goes in your favor. So it's this idea that we have the ability to cause or influence the outcomes. Now, there's three kinds of power here, and we're going to talk about. We're going to give some different frames for thinking about power here. But one simple way, right off the bat, is to think about three different types of power: personal power, that's the individual skill and knowledge that you have; relational power, the power derived from relationships. And let's face it, if you have a good relationship with somebody, it's easier to sway them, so to speak. And the situational power, context-specific power dynamics. So in some situations, you might have more power than others. So for example, if I'm in a room with all of my superiors, so to speak, people that I report to, I'm probably not going to have as much power as if I'm in a class, or I'm in a situation in the classroom where as the teacher, I've been given more power and influence. Now, one of the things to understand is this idea of interdependence, and we talked about this earlier in the class, and to understand that each party has power due to their influence on each other. And so sometimes we think we don't have any power in a situation, maybe somebody else has more authority, legitimate authority than us, but we all, because the nature of relationships are interdependent. And again, we talked about early in the class that conflict doesn't happen when people are not interdependent in the context that we're talking about here in this class. But because people are dependent upon you, because you are part of a group or team or organization where your skills and talents and abilities and voice is needed, that gives you a certain amount of power by default. And sometimes we don't recognize that, right? I'm going to talk more about that in a second, but just to say, you have more power than you think. And so don't just assume because you don't have the leadership role or the managerial role, or you're not the top dog in any particular group, that you don't have any power. So French and Raven talk about 5 different bases of power. And if you were in my organizational behavior class, this is a good review for you, right? So they talk about reward power, the ability to give out rewards; coercive power, the ability to punish other people; legitimate power, this is the power we have by virtue of the office that we hold; referent power, this is the ability, people like you. You're a likable person, you get along with people, you're well known, you're well connected to people. And I kind of have wrestled with this one a little bit sometimes you see this idea of referent power as being sort of who you know power, right? So you are networked, you are well connected. And then I've seen other definitions that refer to this form of power as likability and connection, personal connection and whatnot. I think both of those are important. I think sometimes we can have power just because of who we know. And you know, that old saying, it's not what you know, but it's who you know, can often open up doors for us and give us more influence. And then there's expert power. And so this is the idea that we have power because we know certain things. People rely upon that knowledge and that expertise. And so look through this list and think about what kind of power that you might have, and are you giving away power? Sometimes we want to be liked, right? We want to be accepted. We don't want to rock the boat. We want to be part of the cool kids or whatever, right? And so we give away power, and we also assume that we don't have any. But the reality is, if you're in an interdependent relationship, you probably have more power than you think. Now, there's this idea of equalizing power. And the research is clear. One of the clear findings on conflict is that the lower the power distinction, the power distance, remember that, right, from Geert Hofstede? The lower the power distance, the more likely you will be to come to a win-win solution. And the higher the power distance, the inequality in power, the less likely you are to come to a win-win solution. And think about this. It makes a lot of sense, right? If you're in a room with somebody with a lot more power than you, chances are it's not going to be a win-win. Chances are it's going to be a win-lose, and you're going to lose. And so the bigger the dynamic there, the bigger the range of power, the less likely it's going to be win-win. And so right off the bat, this tells us that one of our goals as leaders is to try to equalize that power, right? So if you're in a leadership role, what do you want to do? You want to sort of empower other people and not always call on the prerogative of your leadership. And think about it. If you're in a high power relationship, you can win the day all the time. But what does that mean? You might feel good about it, but what does that mean for the other people? That means, well, they feel unheard or silenced or rejected, right? So we have to be careful as leaders not to always use that legitimate reward, coercive power that we have in order to win conflict situations. And on the other hand, and I kind of mentioned this, if you are in a less power situation, remember the power that you do have. Do you, for example, have expert power? And this is one of the great ways I think that we can grow in, right? Well, maybe you don't know as much, but you can learn, right? You're a learner. Do your homework. The best way is to gain power, and in some ways is to know your stuff. And the person that brings up, the person that demonstrates they know their stuff, they're often going to hold more sway than the people that are just sort of, opinionating or opining or bloviating or, whatever they do. Now, let me give you an example here. John and Jane. So John and Jane are a couple, and this isn't the same couple as last week where they wanted to go on the vacation. This is a couple now. John wants to consider taking a job in another state. And he reads this classified ad, or he sees it on Craigslist or wherever, and there's a perfect opening for him, but it means moving out to Colorado. Okay, let's just say they live in, Atlanta or something. But then Jane, she has a good career. She's got a good job. And so John comes to her and says, "Hey, Jane, I just found out there's this job opening. It's a perfect fit for me. And we get to move to Colorado. Yippee, doesn't that sound great?" And Jane's like, "Well, what are you talking about? I have a career. I'm moving up in my job. I'm one of the main breadwinners in the family at this point. So I don't think that is going to be happening." All right, so they've got an impasse now, right? He wants to move to Colorado, and so they've both sort of taken sides here and drawn the lines. Now, you might say, well, what are their bases of power in this relationship, right? It almost sounds like a stalemate, right? Well, Jane, because she has reward power, not necessarily legitimate, because usually in a couple, right, the power is supposed to be equal, but because now she is the main breadwinner, she's going to say to John, "Listen, John, you can move to Colorado if you want, but it's going to be by yourself, and good luck with that job," because right now she holds a power position because of the reward power, because of the fact that she earns more money. Now, if it was the other way around, let's just say John was the main breadwinner and Jane was, stay-at-home mom and she took care of the kids and those sorts of things, he might have more sway in that relationship. So you can see that no matter what the situation is here, you always have some form of power because of that interdependence that you have on one another. Okay, so let's talk about distributive versus integrative power. Now, distributive power, this is kind of a fallacy, right? It sort of sees power as a zero-sum game. So in other words, if I give away power to you, if I empower you, that means I'm going to have less power. And this is one of the reasons, quite frankly, why a lot of leaders don't empower people, because they feel like if another person has power, they have less power. Now, we know this is a fallacy, right? Because when we empower people, we get the best of them and we get all of their creative insight, and they're strong contributors and they're committed to the organization. So we want to kind of dispel this, dispel the myth that if you give away power, you're going to have less power. And in the long run, what is that going to do? That's going to equalize that's going to help to remove the barriers in a conflict situation now, because, right, what did we say earlier? That the higher the distance, the less likely there is to be a win-win. So we need to empower other people, include them in the decision making, let them have a voice, and that doesn't mean that every decision is, democratically decided. You're still in charge, you still have the authority, right? But again, if you divest yourself from that strictly and empower other people to, for example, just weigh in on a decision, right? I heard an interesting quote recently is weigh in leads to buy-in, right? So when you let people weigh in on the situation, no matter what the decision is, if they might not like it, the fact that they were able to contribute and give their perspective when the decision finally is made, they're more likely to buy in. The other idea is, and so this leads to this idea of integrative power, right? Shared influence and mutual gain. So when you allow people to contribute to the conversation and the decision, both parties win here. All right, so what do we know about the research and empowering? Well, I already mentioned this one here. Equal power leads to better conflict resolution. So if you're in that superior role by title, if you have that legitimate authority or whatever, divesting yourself and letting people know that they do have power and that you want to empower them, that's one way to reduce the conflict, the potential for conflict, and to resolve the conflict. So acknowledging power, recognizing others' power can help in equalizing the dynamic. So as a leader, you let people know that they do have a certain amount of power. Now, what if you're in that unenviable position where you don't have as much power as you think? Well, first of all, recognize and act on the amount of power that you do have. So in any situation, you're there at the table and you do have a certain amount of power to influence that. So let's go back to John and Jane here, right? So John is kind of stuck now because he wants to move to Colorado, but Jane's quite happy and entrenched there in Atlanta, and she doesn't want to do that. She's the maid burner. Well, what kind of influence or what kind of power does John actually have in that? Well, the fact that they love each other and they want to stay married, right? So because of that mutual love and respect and interdependence, it's not like he can just walk away or that she just wants to walk away, right? So he has the power of the relationship and, betting on the fact that she wants to keep that relationship intact, and she may be willing to sacrifice in order for, for John's in order for John to feel validated and to win in this situation here. Next one is promoting interdependence, right? So the more you can get entrenched in a situation, the more people rely upon you, the more power you have in the situation. So be a contributor. Learn how to be a contributor, learn how to be a voice at the table. Will help you gain a little bit of power in conflict situations. The next one is engage and speak up. And gather information, right? So this is the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? You've heard that one. So sometimes we'll pitch something and we'll get shot down. Okay, well maybe it didn't work on, try one, but the next time pitch it again, try again. Maybe bring some more information. Be persistent. The more persistent you can be, the more people will start to see you as having as having a voice and having something to contribute, right? So stay engaged. Don't just back off just because you got one no. And then, as I mentioned earlier, increase your knowledge and expertise so we can all be learning. When we show up well informed, guess what? People will listen to us, and that's the type of power that can help us win in any situation. Okay, so that's power and conflict. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about different conflict styles. Now, if you recall, for those of you that were in my organizational behavior class, we talked about different conflict styles, this idea that we have different approaches. Not everybody has the same approach to conflict, right? And so Thomas and Kilman came up with a model here of conflict styles. I think now they call it conflict modes, but this may be familiar to you. There's 5 different approaches, general approaches, and again, this is similar to Blake and Mouton's grid, which has to do with concern for others and concern for self, right? So if you imagine high concern for others, low concern for others, high concern for self, low concern for self, you come up with 4 different possible combinations here. Blake and Mouton talked about that in terms of management styles, right? Remember country club and authoritarian leadership and those sorts of things. Well, it's kind of a similar, 4 different styles here. So depending on concern for self and concern for others. So let's talk about these. So the first one is competing, right? Now this would be high concern for self, low concern for others. So competitors are these competitive people. They have to win. They are going for win-lose. They're not going for win-win, but they're going for win-lose. They're going to win and you're going to lose, right? That's competitive style. The next one is collaborating. This is optimal, right? This is the one where we want to win, but we also want the other person to win too. So high concern for self, high concern for others is a collaborating style. The next one is compromising, and this is kind of moderate. This is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's not necessarily in one of the 4 quadrants, but compromising means I give up a little bit of something and you give up a little bit of something. A lot of people are willing to do that. They'll give up if the other person is willing to give up as well. The next one is avoiding. Now this is kind of low concern for self and low concern for others. And we'll talk about dysfunctional strategies here in a second. Sorry, I know the camera keeps going out. I'm not sure what to do about that. We'll talk about dysfunctional strategies, but this is sort of like, you're out of the game. You're not going to argue. You're not going to listen to other people. You're just sort of avoiding. And then the last one is accommodating. This is a high regard for other people and low regard for yourself. So if somebody else asserts themselves, you're like, okay, whatever, right? Now, you probably know that, human beings are complex, and so we're not always one style or the others. And so we might have a dominant one, but we also have learned to deal with things and sort of move in and out, so to speak, of different styles. And so this is what's called a pattern of conflict resolution, right? So for example, you might be combative and competitive, right? And you try to win, but then when you don't win, you sort of resort to a, avoiding strategy. You sort of like check out, right? So that's kind of easy to imagine. Or your default strategy might be to collaborate, right? And maybe the other person doesn't want to collaborate. They're a competitive type of person, right? So maybe at that point you sort of move to the compromising, right? So it's like, okay, you're kind of giving up your position there. Now, another way to think about conflict styles was given to us by John Gottman. Now, by the way, John Gottman was more of a marriage relationship kind of a guy, but these apply in personal relationships like a marriage, and they also apply in other contexts as well. So he talked about three different ways that we can respond to somebody in a conflict situation. So in other words, a bid is something that somebody gives us, and then a response is the way that we respond to them, okay? So he talks about three of these. The first one is turning towards somebody. So let's just imagine in a situation if somebody says something that kind of bothers you, you turn towards them and you acknowledge them and you listen to them and you begin to reason with them, right? The next one is turning away. And this is when somebody presents something that's conflictual to you, you sort of like turn away. And this is similar to the avoiding style, right? And then the third position is turning against. giving a hostile response. So somebody says something you don't like, and you just kind of go, you go all ballistic, and you get back up in their face, and maybe you get defensive or you get argumentative, right? Okay, so those are the three types of responses. Now, let me give you an example here of those for maybe something you can relate to. Let's just imagine, let's go back to John and Jane, okay? This is our couple that wants to go to Colorado, or John wants to go to Colorado and Jane doesn't. Imagine one day it's a Sunday afternoon and John's sitting around and he's engrossed in the football game, and it's 2 minutes left to the halftime, and it's really exciting, intense, and he's totally into it. And by the way, he made himself a snack on the way to the couch, and he left a big mess on the counter. And so Jane walks out, and Jane says, "John, you left a big mess here on the counter," right? And she's kind of a neat freak, and he's a bit sloppy. All right, it's kind of like the Oscar and Felix dynamic. But she says, "John, you left a big mess here on the counter. Can you come and clean this up right away?" And John's sitting here engrossed in his game. All right, so let's just say, using this idea of these three different positions, let's just say the first one he could turn towards, right? And he could say, "Okay, honey, I know I left a mess there. It's almost halftime. Just give me 2 more minutes and I'll come and clean it up." All right, that's a good thing. Jane's probably going to like that. Okay, I get it. He's into the game. Now, the other one could be turning away. And she says, "John, come and clean up." And he's like, "I can't be bothered right now. You deal with it." Or he just says, I'm into the game right now. And she says, "All right, whatever. I'll just clean it up myself." Now, John might win that one for the minute, but he's going to pay for that one later on when he has to acknowledge the fact that he kind of blew her off, right? And then the third one is turning against. So what could John do then? Okay, well, Jane says, "John, you need to clean up the kitchen." He says, "Jane, why are you always nagging me? It's football season. This is an exciting part of the game. I love to watch my game. Why don't you just get off my back?" Whoo, John's going to pay for that one later on, isn't he, right? Okay, so these are the three different ways that we can approach something using this Gottman model. And again, turning towards is the preferred style, right? So we don't want to avoid, we don't want to go to combat, we want to acknowledge the other person. Maybe he could say, "Honey, you're right, I did leave a big mess, but this game is so good, I'm gonna do it in just a couple minutes. So thanks for being patient with me." All right, that's probably a good response. That's probably going to make her happy. Now, when to choose the appropriate conflict styles here? Well, the first thing is to think about the situational appropriateness, choosing the right style for the situation. Now, again, you might be in a situation where you have more power or less power, so you want to choose the right response there, right? Building a collaborative approach, working together for mutual benefit, right? So John and Jane, they're kind of working together here, and so that they could both, he gets to watch the game and she gets her clean situation. She gets her clean kitchen. Okay, now the last thing we're going to talk about today are dysfunctional conflict strategies. And if you remember at the very beginning of the class, I said that the problem with conflict management is not so much the conflict itself, but it's the way that we deal with the conflict that causes the most problems, right? So it's not the goals or whatever. John and Jane, they're on the same team, right? They both, want to enjoy their Sunday afternoon, and they both like a clean house. And so it's not so much the goal incompatibility. They both have a similar goal to live together as happily married couple, enjoy a clean house and enjoy their leisurely time. But it's the way they deal with it that can be dysfunctional. So let's talk about some of these common dysfunctional strategies. The first one is avoidance, hoping the issue will blow over. Now, this is the head in the sand. I'm going to be an ostrich. I'm just going to avoid it. This is typically not a good strategy. I'm going to talk about when you can use some of these things here in a minute, but typically avoiding is not a good idea. You can sweep the dirt under the rug only so long, but if you keep doing that, eventually somebody's going to trip over that bump, right? That's my little illustration for that. So you don't want to sweep things under the rug. Oftentimes too, or sometimes, let's just say oftentimes, but sometimes when people avoid things, it's kind of a passive-aggressive response, isn't it? Have you ever said something to somebody and they heard you, but they didn't respond? And you're not like, well, yeah, they're avoiding me, but I think they're also mad or they're angry about this or they don't want to, they don't want to hear what I have to say, right? Maybe something I said triggered them. It triggered some kind of emotional response. And so now their avoidance is actually an act of hostility. They're not coming at me combatively, but their avoidance says it all, right? Okay, so you don't want to be that person that comes across as passive aggressive in your avoidance either. The next one is withdrawal, reducing interaction to avoid conflict. Now, sometimes we just we just leave people alone. Like we avoid them, we withdraw from a group, we walk the other way when we see them coming down the alley, right? Or we see them come down the hallway. It's like, oh, there's that person, and I have this issue with them, but I'm just going to sort of withdraw. And sometimes we withdraw. It can be physical, right? We can physically withdraw, but sometimes it's emotionally we can withdraw. Imagine a meeting situation at work, right? And everybody's talking, and you kind of say your part, your thoughts on it, and you kind of get shot down, right? And all of a sudden you're like, you kind of like shrink down. You're not a competitive person. You don't have much power in this particular dynamic and setting. And so you just sort of like withdraw. And for the rest of the meeting, you are like checked out, right? That is an approach, right? That's an approach. Now, is that a good approach? Not in the long term, right? Sometimes we all need to kind of duck out and kind of check our feelings and all that. But in the long term, you don't want to be that person that just sort of shrinks and withdraws whenever they get into a conflict situation. The next one is imposition, unilateral resolution imposition. Okay, so this is for the guy or the gal that's got a lot of power and they say, I don't really care. I've heard you guys, but here's what we're going to do. And now that's kind of that high power differential. We'll talk about if and when that is appropriate, but generally speaking, that's not an appropriate response because what are you going to do? You're going to damage a lot of relationships, right? Triangulation involving third parties. So this is the idea that we get into a conflict with somebody and then afterwards we go talk to our friend and say, oh man, I got to tell you what just happened with Joe over here, right? I was in this meeting and he kind of shot me down. They're always doing that to me. And this person's like, yeah, Joe does that to me as well, right? So this idea of getting somebody else involved. We all need to share. We all need confidence and friends at work. But if this is your only strategy, if you don't deal with the conflict itself, that's not a good strategy. How about manipulation? Indirect means without regards for other. Okay, so imagine the situation, you're with the boss and all of a sudden you get in a conflict situation and you sort of leave it and then you go away and you talk to you don't talk to Susie, but you talk to Bill, and Bill is your boss's peer, and you have a good relationship with him. So you go to him. This is sort of combining triangulation, and you go to him and say, man, you're not going to believe what Joe said we had to do. And Bill's like, well, let me talk to him. I think you're in the right here, and we all know Joe can be stubborn on these things. So let me talk to him. And so all of a sudden, what did you do? You sort of did an end around in the triangulation, and you're sort of manipulating somebody else, getting their sympathy so that you can get your will done with somebody else. So this can kind of be manipulative, right? The next one is absolute framing, black and white, using black and white terms. Now, this is I talk about this in my book, but this is the idea of cognitive distortions, right? Sometimes we frame things in either black and white. It's like either we can or we can't. We can't, there's no middle ground here. And sometimes we do that in conflict situations. And this can be kind of manipulative, right? Especially in a high stakes situation. Some of these case studies we've been looking at in this class, where somebody says, I think we need to spend more money on this. And, the money guy says, no, we absolutely can't do that because if we spend the money on this, we're going to run out of money and the lights are going to go out and that's going to be the end of the ministry. And you're like, wow, that's pretty extreme. I simply wanted to have an outreach event, right? And this guy's talking about, going out of business here. So sometimes black and white thinking or absolute framing, this can also be a bit manipulative, right? So again, this shows you how power works, right? So this guy's got the power of the purse and you make a suggestion and they say, no, we can't do that. If we do that, it's going to be a disaster for everybody. We're going to go out of business, right? So you want to try to avoid this absolute framing, like everything's a dire emergency, everything's a crisis. Everything has to do with money. And a lot of people in organizations, listen, money's important. We know money's important in businesses. It's important in churches and ministries. It's important. I'm not minimizing it. But you don't want to be the guy that dangles the purse strings over somebody to manipulate and get your way and use this absolute framing. The next one is payback or revenge, seeking harm or withholding good. Now, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, saith the Lord, right? This is not an approach that you should use. This is kind of a prison yard approach, right? Where somebody does you wrong and you wait for them out on the floor, or whatever they call it. You wait to stab them or something with a fork. I don't know. This is a strategy we don't use, right? We don't use payback. Now, again, sometimes we sort of, in a passive aggressive way, we can kind of pay people back. So if somebody says something we don't like, or we get an argument, or they shut us down, we can punish them by not interacting with them, not getting along with them, avoiding them, right? So there's kind of passive aggressive ways that sometimes we get revenge on people. And you want to check yourself on this one. You don't want to be that person that's like, you're checking out, or you're withdrawing, or you're doing things behind people's backs, right? You can kind of see how these strategies here can kind of all work together. So you don't want to get revenge on somebody by withholding your contributions. Like sometimes you get our feelings hurt in a meeting, like, well, I'm not going to say anything anymore. Well, you're still needed in that meeting. You still have that role and that position and that expertise. So you don't want to get revenge on somebody in there by withholding your information. Now, sometimes you get our feelings hurt and you might have to come back, but generally speaking, you don't want to get revenge on people. And then the last one is compromise, negotiating by giving something up. Now, sometimes compromise is going to work, right, in the short term, but if we always compromise or we're always giving up, we're going to end up with hurt feelings in the long term. So there's costs and consequences of these dysfunctional strategies. Harmful side effects, long-term damage to relationships and trust. And you can see a lot of these things, right? If you're doing end runs, if you're avoiding, if you're manipulating, if you're getting revenge, it's obvious to see how these are not going to be good. And again, you're always thinking about conflict in terms of the goals and the relationship. So we have the goal, but then we also have to think about this relationship with this person. And so if you use these dysfunctional strategies, you might, win the battle, but you're going to lose the long-term relational reward, so to speak. And they can have excessive costs, emotional and resource strains. Now, can you ever use any of these strategies? Well, perhaps in limited doses, and let me suggest these here. Avoidance and withdrawal. When the other person has more power or resolution is impossible, right? So you're not going to get your way, and so you kind of withdraw from the field of battle, so to speak. I would also say, too, you can use avoidance for a season, right? You can say, you can check out or whatever, but then you come back and say, hey, I really thought about this, and let me try some other ways to communicate this or get this across in the future, right? So it might be a temporary solution to avoid or withdraw until tempers cool off or whatever, right? Imposition, and this is like where it's my way or the highway, right? I'm the boss, I'm the one with most power here, I'm going to impose my will. Sometimes in emergencies or when immediate action is needed. So sometimes from the fog of war, somebody needs to be decisive, right? So if the house is on fire, you're not going to have a conference and debate what you should do at that point. You're just going to listen to the person in authority, and you're going to get out of there, right? Well, not every situation is a crisis, but sometimes there are emergencies, and you just need to sort of go along and get along and those sorts of things. And then triangulation. This is where you go to a third party, right? Sometimes it's okay, right, to get advice or outside perspective, but not to go to gossip about a person, to put another person down, to get an ally so that you can manipulate this person, right? That's not a good use of triangulation, but just to get some advice and to have somebody to share with. I think we all do that, right? So it can be appropriate. And then compromise. You can use this when win-win is not achievable after attempt. So you've tried to win, you've tried to compromise, you've tried to get along and see the other person's perspective, but it's not going to happen, so you can compromise. You don't want to do this all the time, because this can be why is compromise a dysfunctional strategy? Because it is a lose-lose, right? You're losing something and they're losing something, right? So if we want to get to win-win, that's not compromising. So if you're always compromising, what does that mean? Well, it means you're always losing to a certain degree. That's going to end up, you're going to have hurt feelings and resentment towards the people that you're, in conflict with. All right, so in summary, what can we say? Power in conflict situation involves understanding various types of power dynamics. Conflict styles vary based on the balance between assertiveness and cooperation. And dysfunctional conflict strategies can have long-term negative impact, but they can be appropriate in certain situations. Well, listen, that's all I've got to say for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope this was helpful to you. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next lesson.